I suspect you know how the rest of this piece goes. In fact, it's a piece that's all about knowing how the rest of it goes based on what you've already been given. It's the famous Pachelbel Canon written by a Baroque-era composer, Johann Pachelbel, and it's a piece that is in so many people's ears we might not think it would provide a very interesting musical example to take a look at. But I want to work with it because it takes us into two main areas that we're going to be interested in for the remainder of this series. To start out with, we've been working with melody for the most part by itself. Occasionally we've had harmonizations for it, but we've tended to analyze it carefully only in terms of a backdrop of a mode of some type. And what I want us to be able to start doing is looking at ways in which larger musical textures can be built, either by combining melodies together in some way or through this notion of harmonizing a melody. Now, I did briefly talk about this earlier, in particular in episode 7, where I gave us an example of a Schubert tune. And then we listened to Schubert's harmonization of it. Now, there's no mistaking the fact in that context that this is the melody. In a sense, whatever is going on underneath is accompaniment to that melody. Oddly enough, the Pachelbel Canon is a piece that is often performed in a way that gets us to flip things around. A lot of people hear that opening idea as the theme of the piece. And in a sense, what comes afterwards kind of fades into the background because there's so much activity with this kind of stuff that this, with these long, slow notes, tends to become a kind of accompaniment to this. Actually, it's supposed to be the other way around. And there's no surprise in the impact this piece has had. That is to say, where people think of this as the theme, because that's not actually what Pachelbel wrote. Pachelbel came from a time period where often you could indicate these things called harmonies or chords just by writing a bass line and some numbers to go with that. So for example, Pachelbel didn't write all of this stuff. All he wrote was a bass line. And then he would write the melody. And people would know to supply these kinds of chords to go with that melody. So this is something that we are not used to hearing in the form that Pachelbel intended. This is an arrangement. It's not actually what Pachelbel wrote. As a result, that arrangement tends to draw our attention away from what's supposed to be the true melody and what is actually taking place. So the first thing I want to say is that this idea of providing an accompaniment to a melody can be done by providing these things called chords or harmonies, and that is specifically what we'll be looking at in great detail in the final episode for this series. But what I want to do in this particular episode is to see what's actually going on in Pachelbel's melody itself, because there's something quite striking taking place. Of course, if I leave out that accompaniment and just listen to the melodic line at all, I keep hearing layers being added in. like a new thing is being added one layer at a time. I ended up with 3 layers there. And rather than that taking place, actually, it's the same thing taking place 3 times. It's hard to tell on the piano because all the sounds kind of blend in with each other. If you look at original instrumentation for a composition like this, and you can see at least a few of these renditions on YouTube where you can actually see the players live. We have 3 violins who are playing, and it's a little bit easier to hear what's taking place if you can hear and see the violinists playing. And what you discover is that there's actually just one very long melody that's taking place, and then each second, third violinist comes in playing the identical melody. So what they're doing is simply starting the same melody but at a different time. It's a little bit like when children are being introduced to singing in parts. Often they're given rounds like 3 blind mice, and what they learn is that if you can learn how to sing a particular melodic line and then learn how to introduce the same melodic line at correct time points thereafter, you can have an entire class singing just one melody and yet create a lovely, beautiful 3-part musical texture. So we can start 3 blind mice over there with a group of students, 3 blind mice over there, a little bit later, 3 blind mice a few measures later over there. And if the melody has been skillfully written, they all blend together in a very harmonious fashion. So that's something that's called a round. But the Pachelbel Canon, of course, has this other name, canon. And canon comes from ancient Greek. It's an ancient Greek term that means originally reed. So a kind of thing that grows very straight and that you could use to measure things with as a kind of ruler. And that's one of the more prominent meanings of this term canon. The idea of a canon is something that provides a rule, or in the context of a musical composition, that there's some part of the music that provides a rule. In the case of the Pachelbel Canon, it is that initial melody. When it starts to play, all of the subsequent melodies will play as well, just staged at the right times. So in a sense, it's a bit of a paradox. It's the sound of many melodies, but only one. So what we'll want to do is start looking at what Pachelbel is doing there. And above all, what I'm going to be interested in is developing a couple of tools for reflecting on how multiple melodies affect us as listeners, because Pachelbel is doing some very interesting things for very particular compositional reasons. What we're going to be interested in general is a topic area known as musical counterpoint. It comes from older terminology for note against note, punkt, contrapuntus, and the idea there is that we're assessing how melodic lines move in relation to each other. There will be 2 dimensions in particular that we'll be interested in: their relative distance from each other and their relative motion to one another. But that's going to be understood in a rather peculiar way, as we see. And the reason why we're going to be doing this is because it's really important to start to understand how you can create rich musical textures by writing more than just a single great melodic line. It'll be helpful for us to start to think about ways in which melodies can interact with each other. The next thing that we'll be studying in this particular episode is this whole idea of imitation. So the Pachelbel Canon, that's a very strict form of imitation. Imitation more generally just means one part imitating in some way what another part or other parts are doing. And we'll want to narrow that down to just short melodic segments rather than dealing with a whole canon. So those will be the 2 main things that we'll be looking at. To start out with techniques for assessing musical counterpoint, and then the concept and techniques of imitation. So what I've drawn on the board is the opening imitation between just the first 2 melodic entries in the Pachelbel Canon. I haven't put in the third because that would get to be a little bit complicated for us, although we will look at the idea of 3-part counterpoint in a particular segment of the next episode. And we'll discover ways in which we want to simplify how to analyze 3-part counterpoint, or even 4-part. Okay, so I've got two main terms that I've put on the board, relative distance and relative motion. I'll take a look at relative distance first. So what this is doing is measuring how far apart the different melodic lines are from each other. And this is simply another application of interval analysis with which we're already familiar. And we're doing the same kind of analysis that we've always done. We have a sense of diatonic interval sizes, which is always given by the main numbers, and then qualifications of them. And so one thing I notice is that to start out with, you can see how this melodic line comes in and initiates the process and then continues on. And then you can see how what is coming in afterwards is imitating precisely, but at a later point in time, what the first melodic line did. And then this thing would start doing that as the music continued. So this is one reason why, for example, there were medieval compositions called kachas that were associated with the idea of the chase, hunting songs. You could imagine, for example, a rabbit or something like that starting to run, and then it's being chased by a fox or something like that. So whatever topography the initial party to the chase runs over, that's the same topography that the chasing party will have to go over. Okay? So think of that chase idea, at least at this basic level, to get some sense of the imitation that's taking place. Now, what we're interested in is the fact that when I consider relative distance, I am seeing a lot of the same type of interval for quite some period of time, right? And so that's why these parts tend to blend in with one another quite a lot up to this point in time. So remember, there's a reason why a lot of people hear the accompaniment figure for the Pachelbel Canon, given in its sort of pop form. And that is when we have a melody that's coming in here, it is moving in a very typically slow way, and it's hard to hear a kind of a melodic connection between those notes. And then if another melody is coming in, it's very difficult to hear that again because things are moving very slowly, and we have a lot of similar intervals being produced. Okay? Now, keep in mind that if you hear, dare I say, a proper performance of the Pachelbel Canon, and there are plenty of them on YouTube, you can hear the melodic lines coming in much more easily when, instead of having that really extended form of accompaniment, which makes it so hard to hear the true melodic lines, if that just is given as a series of chords, it begins to be a lot easier to hear this melody and also this imitation. But there's still a further problem. Even if you just played the chords, still these melodic lines tend to blend in with each other because of the similarity of thirds throughout. Now, what I want to do is always give us reasons for looking at these particular techniques of analysis. And I'm getting some information from this relative distance. Yes, there are major thirds and minor thirds. It's a lot of thirds. It's a lot of similarity. Therefore, when you have a lot of continuous similarity, it is going to make it difficult for any listener to hear meaningful distinction between these parts. It's just going to sound like there's an upper part with something kind of mirroring it underneath. Now, if we start to consider relative motion, we might start to get some sense of why Pachelbel makes particular compositional choices. We can say that as long as two parts are moving in the same direction at the same time, they are moving in similar motion. So as we can see through our readout of relative distance, up to this point in time, S for similar, the relative motion between parts is kind of ensuring that things will blur into each other, and it's going to be hard for us to hear this notion of canonic imitation. This is why no one should feel even remotely guilty if all they've ever heard is the conventional performance of Pachelbel with the wildly distended accompaniment. What chance are you going to have to hear canonic imitation, especially when it begins with something that uses a lot of similar relative motion? Now, what's striking here, I can see registered in relative distance sudden changes in the interval relationship between the parts. Suddenly I've got a major sixth, a perfect octave, a minor sixth, minor third, augmented fourth, perfect fourth. A lot of stuff is happening all at once. Why is that? Let's think again about relative motion. I notice that unlike the similar motion I had before, and by the way, similar motion holds true regardless of whether you have the same diatonic interval sizes being used throughout. I mean, this is something that we could say that we're hearing a lot of parallel thirds, parallel motion, but similar motion is a sort of broader idea. If we had started out with something up here, for example, that had to be a perfect fifth away, we'd still identify that as being similar motion because these parts are moving in the same direction, always up to this point at the same time, whether it's up or down. But at this point, all of a sudden, I have these parts moving up, sorry, these notes, not parts, while this part, these notes, move downwards. So this is contrary motion that's taking place, okay? And what's significant about that is C for contrary. What's significant about that is it makes it so much easier for listeners to hear a meaningful distinction between the two different parts. Let's listen to that development. I'll play the original, not that silly A. Right away, my ear has a chance to sense melodic independence, that they're not kind of in lockstep with each other. So in this sense, relative motion and relative distance are complementary to one another. As contrary motion takes place, I'm going to see that reflected in the relative distance between the intervals. And this is something that's very important. When you learn to actually write counterpoint, which we won't be doing in this course, it's a very complex subject. Back in the day, when I was an undergraduate student, counterpoint at a basic level, 18th century counterpoint, was a full year of coursework, 6 credits. And then there was also a course in 16th century counterpoint that was an additional 3-credit course. There's a lot of stuff to learn there. And one of the things that you're learning are all these rules of counterpoint. And it would include things like how many notes are you allowed of similar motion all at once, and how often do you have to use contrary motion. And the reason for that was always compositional. It can seem very rule-laden, but the whole idea is to be effective at creating musical textures where there's a kind of equal distribution of musical interest between the different parts. So this is why people get really interested in developing rules for counterpoint. I just want to look at it from the standpoint of analysis and seeing what a skilled composer like Pachelbel does. So Pachelbel starts out with similar motion, and before he goes too far with that, he recognizes that however he writes his initial melody, he's going to want to set it up in such a way that when it's imitated later on, as it is here, that contrary motion will be introduced. Now, the next thing that happens is it seems as though we've got a doubling of activity taking place in the lead voice, the one that came first. And that is something that will be, of course, followed by the second part voice later on. And then when the third comes in, which is at this point, it will eventually be doing the same thing. Now, we might think that that is something to do with motion per se, because it's rhythm, it's changing the number of notes that one part is playing versus another. And we're going to want to be a little bit careful with how we understand it. First of all, notice that I'm not just judging relative distance where the notes have the same onset. So not just that D, D, A, C sharp, F sharp, D, and so on. I'm keeping track of the fact that every step of the way there is some awareness that the relationship of this part to that part is changing in relative distance. So when I go from D to F sharp, I've suddenly radically decreased the distance between those parts. So that musically is very interesting, is very arresting. Here they become very close with each other, arriving at a major third together. Suddenly now, an augmented fourth, that's quite a dissonant interval. I'm hopefully going to be moving to something consonant before too long, and there I am going right away to a perfect interval. And of course, as you can imagine, amongst the rules of counterpoint that one learns are how do you use dissonant intervals, how often should you be using consonant intervals, what types of consonant interval. So these are all the kinds of compositional considerations that come into actually writing musical counterpoint. But what I want us to notice then is that I have to provide some kind of analysis in terms of relative motion here. Now, if I look at this particular circumstance, I can notice a couple of things. First of all, if it's the case that I'm hearing each of these intervals, it's rather like I've got like another eighth note or something like that being played in that part. So not just something like this, but I'm thinking along these lines. Right? So I'm being very literal about that. In a way, it kind of helps if I'm literal in that fashion on a piano, because piano has one characteristic that's generally true across the board, and that is the notion of decay of pitch. Once I play a pitch, depending on the make of the piano, the amplitude of that pitch rapidly dies away. What's very different and often very eye-opening for a keyboard player like me, who plays the piano a bunch, or who used to at least, I still remember when I started taking organ lessons and actually performing a little bit on the organ as a church organist, I was actually really struck by how different my experience was of contrapuntal music, because on an organ, this pitch is heard as clearly at the beginning as it is at the end and all the way through in between. You can really hear these kinds of interval shifts in a very palpable way while you play them, and it can be quite eye-opening, ear-opening I guess would be a better expression, to have the opportunity to play contrapuntal works that you've done on the piano and then play them on the organ, and it's kind of like your ears have been cleaned out and you're like, oh my goodness, I just hear so much more taking place contrapuntally. But I'm showing you this because what I notice is that if I think in those terms, that this pitch is actually being sustained through to that point, then from there to there, I in fact have contrary motion. And then likewise, if I were assuming something like this, then from there to there, I have similar motion. And of course, that would also be the case from there to there, I might think. But we come across something really odd here. I actually have something taking place that's new in these areas. This actually isn't moving anywhere from there to there while this is. One part is staying in place while the other continues to move. Same thing here. From there to there, this pitch is not moving while in this part we have two pitches that are ascending, right? So once again, from there to there, relative to that, no motion is taking place in one part while motion continues in another. So we have a third term of analysis that we use for relative motion, and that is oblique motion. And that means that one part, with respect to pitch, is immobile. Now, I am going to get literal. You might say, oh, of course, well, I have these quarter notes here. Therefore, I suppose this idea of oblique motion, that means that something is moving in some direction relative to another thing that's stationary. Well, of course, this is stationary. That's a quarter note, that's a quarter note. These are eighth notes, so I guess by definition, one is holding while the others are moving. Oddly enough, this has absolutely nothing to do with rhythm in that direct or immediate sense. If I literally wrote this, where I am in fact providing as many note values in that part as I am in the other one, I would still analyze that in precisely the same way. When we talk about relative motion, actually, it's motion purely in what I would call pitch space, meaning that it's motion as perceived slowly in terms of pitch. I'm reminded of this wonderful movie from many years ago, going back to my childhood years, sort of, Jurassic Park. And at one point, we've got some characters that are facing a T-Rex, and some, I think, paleontologist is telling these kids, don't move or run or something like that, because the Tyrannosaurus Rex literally can't see you unless you start to move. So if you stay dead still, you're safe, you're fine, more or less. And in a way, that's what we're thinking of here with the kind of T-Rex vision. In this case, the contrapuntal Rex can only see motion in terms of pitch space itself. So whatever is going on here, I could even do something wild and crazy and repeat that note even more, but with respect to pitch, no motion is taking place whatsoever until I move there. And that's where I recognize that there was contrary motion. Likewise here, whether it's eighths or sixteenths or just this simple quarter note value, okay, I contrapuntally, in terms of relative motion, can see nothing happening. No motion is taking place until this shift happens. So this is why when we do contrapuntal analysis, we want to be very particular, keeping track of relative motion precisely at all points in time, because this is something that will be extremely meaningful if you have singers playing these lines. Violins are certainly going to hear this because they can sustain their pitch throughout. And Pachelbel originally was writing this for just 3 isolated violins, so you can hear the relationship between them very clearly. We want to pay careful attention to the impact that has on our hearing, and then likewise what this is doing for the relationship between these parts. It starts out with a counterpoint that makes it hard to distinguish meaningfully between the parts, and then as Pachelbel begins to introduce other types of relative motion, contrary motion, oblique motion, all of a sudden that radically enriches our capacity to take an interest in these different musical parts, to hear them as individuals, even if they're behaving in the same way, just at different points in time, right? So this is why we get interested in these techniques of analysis for counterpoint. It's to help us understand the kinds of dimensions you need to pay attention to if you want to create melodic interest in all parts that you're working with in a contrapuntal texture. And so, of course, I could continue to provide that analysis throughout, but as you can imagine, it's going to get quite busy and complicated because Pachelbel is just making so much happen in terms of the choreography of similar motion, contrary motion, and oblique motion. So for this course, when you do analysis of counterpoint, this is precisely what I will be asking you to do in an assignment, in an exam. considering relative distance in these terms, considering relative motion in these terms, and noting how they fit together. Now, the next thing that I want to do is look at this idea of imitation itself, because the Pachelbel Canon is quite a complex work. And in fact, I know of at least one YouTube video where you could search Pachelbel Canon score, something like that. You'll be able to follow along all of the canonic parts that are played by the violins. So much is taking place there. The challenge with that is that it can kind of tax our ability to see the consequences of certain modes of behavior in this imitation. We want to kind of narrow things down. In particular, what we want to do is work with a type of piece that uses what we call shorter points of imitation. So rather than the entire piece being created as one gigantic imitation, we look at a piece that makes use of small bits of imitation. The classic type of piece that does that is something that's called a fugue. So what we're going to do next is I'll wipe the board clean and consider ways in which imitation can take place. The Pachelbel Canon, although it's relatively complex, working with 3 melodic lines derived from one, nonetheless it's using a very basic type of imitation. If we kind of shorten things up and work with just a smaller musical theme, we'll be able to consider many other forms of imitation. So I'll summarize those and then we will apply them to a Bach fugue. So we want to start to delve a little more deeply into the idea of imitation. The Pachelbel, even though it's a very rich musical texture, nonetheless is working with a concept of imitation that's quite basic. Whatever imitative parts are entering the texture, they are preserving the original melodic contour with its original pacing and even starting on the original note. So in the Pachelbel examples we were listening to, that was an F sharp, and in fact it was the same pitch, F sharp 5, that they were all coming in on. That seems very much like what a conventional round does. So if everyone in a classroom were singing Three Blind Mice or something like that, everyone is going to be joining in, starting on exactly the same note, playing the same melodic contour, and using the same pacing so that everything fits together very nicely. So in a sense, we can listen to that as a sort of baseline version of imitation that we can call normal. However, there's one slight change I want to make, and that is to say that you can still have a normal imitation, that is to say something that preserves the original melodic contour, close enough, with its original pacing, but you can actually start on a different note. So it'll sound like it's being imitating somewhere else, but nonetheless sounding very similar. We'll be working with a Bach fugue subject after this segment, where we'll hear that. The theme that we'll be listening to, it's actually called a fugue subject, is this. And then we'll hear an imitation of it, starting on that note that the original subject landed on. Now, if you listen carefully, you will have noticed a slight shift, and we'll get to see this in notation in just a moment. But my original fugue subject went down by semitone initially, and then up by a few steps, and then started leaping around. Just take it that far. The normal imitation that I gave after that made a slight change. So you might have heard how the first one does this. The second one did this. So you can hear how that imitation is actually undertaking a small leap. Okay, a slight shift has been made in the melodic contour. I still have a sense of imitation taking place for two main reasons. First of all, my ear registers motion upwards and downwards, and that same relative distinction is being maintained. If my original started here, went down, and then up, the imitation also went down and then up, okay? So it was possible for me to have a slight alteration to one of the intervals and yet convince my ear that these things sound related to one another. The other thing that Bach maintains in that context is the rhythm. The rhythm is identical in both cases, and often our ears will rely on rhythmic consistency to create at a subconscious level a sense of identity between two things that may otherwise have some slight variations in them. Now we have a term for that. If I have a literal imitation taking place, that is to say where the original intervals are being preserved precisely, as well as the up and down motion of the contour, we call that a real normal imitation. If some shift has been made for some reason, we call that a tonal imitation, okay? So both of these can be understood in the context of a normal imitation. In a sense, the original contour is being preserved with the original pacing. However, there might be one shift, usually, maximum of two, but usually just one, that is inserted to make this fit into the larger musical context. Why tonal? Typically, a shift is being made for tonal considerations, the kind of key one happens to be in. All right, so keep that in mind. Normal imitation, you can think at a very basic level of something like the Pachelbel Canon or Three Blind Mice, what have you, but keep in mind that normal imitation can also involve starting at a different pitch level with the possible necessity for making a slight shift in one of the intervals. And like I say, this will make much clearer sense when we can actually look at these examples notated and then hear how they're used. The other thing that you can do is turn a melody upside down. So remember that where I was suggesting before that a normal imitation is one which is preserving, even in the tonal context, the same sense of up and down in that same sequence. So I had going down, up, down, down, and then up. That was being preserved in my tonal imitation. Down, up, down, down, up, and so on. Inversion is where we flip-flop that. And again, I will save that for a particular example so that you can visually see it while you hear it. But if my original is going down, then my inverted imitation goes up, and vice versa. If my original then goes up, my inverted imitation goes down. Okay? So keep that in mind. We will be able to see that and hear that at the same time in the next segment. Next thing we can consider is the possibility for retrograde, which is where you turn that melodic segment backwards. Okay? Retrograde inversions are notoriously difficult to hear. Usually, even trained musicians are able to recognize them only once it's been pointed out or they've seen a musical score. It's very hard to hear that on the fly, but I will give you a fantastic example of retrograde imitation for the last segment in this particular episode. So keep that in mind. The possibility for combining things is there. So a retrograde would ordinarily mean a retrograde of a normal imitation. However, you can also combine retrograde with inversion. You could have a retrograde inverted imitation that would be spectacularly difficult to recognize by ear. So all of these considerations are by themselves just concerned with melodic contour, okay, with the actual pitches that we're working with. However, there's also timing that can be changed, and that's, in this context, the concept of duration, in particular, augmentation and diminution, augmenting note values and diminishing note values, making them smaller. So augmenting the duration or diminishing the duration of each note. If I have a melody that is being given in an augmented imitation, that means that if my original were all quarter notes, for example. An augmented version conventionally would double those note values. So they would each be a half note. And what that means is that the imitation would sound twice as slow as the original. Conversely, diminution means you cut the note values in half. So once again, if my original subject or melodic line were in quarter notes, if I had imitation in diminution, it would be given in eighth notes, and therefore it would sound twice as fast. So augmentation will make it sound twice as slow, diminution twice as fast. This is halving the values, that's doubling the values. And then I can combine these two things together. So I could have, of course, obviously, if I hear something augmented, it could be normal imitation, it could be of an inversion, it could be of a retrograde version, it could be of a retrograde inversion. And likewise, I could do the same thing with diminution. So all of these components can be combined. And there's just one other term that I'll introduce, and that is where you can have a series of these things taking place simultaneously, in some sense overlapping with each other, which we refer to as a stretto. And we'll see particular examples of that drawn from a wonderful Bach fugue in C major. So here we are looking at the fugue subject that I was talking about before. We can finally see it written down, and I'm showing a couple of things in the shape of the melodic contour itself. What I'm going to do is play the tune for you once more. This is indicating where the first imitation of that fugue subject will come in. Now, what I'm trying to show with these lines is how the melodic contour implies a kind of expanding wedge. What I'll do is play the melody hanging on to the notes that establish new parameters for the contour. That is to say, things that move it either up or down. So if you listen carefully, there's an implication of a downward motion and an upward motion So we call that a typical wedge-shaped fugue subject, and they were actually quite popular amongst many composers, Bach included. And what they are doing is, in a sense, setting up a single melodic line that implies more than one melodic line. It's almost like there's an internal contrary motion counterpoint in the melody. Now, the subject itself just stays up here at the end. That is as far as it goes. But that implicit two-part counterpoint, that contrary motion expansion of the melodic contour, you can see it growing bigger and bigger, sets up the imitation that will follow. So I'll play this using the QuickTime instruments I have set up on the website. And then we'll hear how Bach brings in the first imitation precisely where that wedge implies the initial fugue subject to be going. So I'll play now the imitation of the first fugue subject. And of course, the imitation itself has that wedge shape and likewise implies another entry point for the next imitation. And let's listen to that before I come back and look more closely at that first imitation. Okay, so we have a fugue subject with 2 points of imitation. Let's look more closely at the first imitation. As you can see, this roughly preserves the interval contour of the originating fugue subject, but there is that slight shift that we noted before, where instead of going down by a second, it goes down by a third. The reason why it sounds like an imitation of the fugue subject is because even if it makes that one slight shift, nonetheless, it is a downward shift, just like in the original melodic contour, and then it moves in the same way, in the same direction as the original did. Right? So the other thing that it's preserving, of course, is precisely the same rhythmic structure. So this is an example of a tonal rather than a real answer or real imitation to the first fugue subject. Whereas when we go to the second imitation, that one we could refer to as a real imitation, because even though it's octave lower, nonetheless it's preserving precisely the same interval relationships throughout. Next thing I'll point out here is that when we do our analysis of imitation of fugue subjects, we're only interested in the fugue subject itself, even if imitation continues afterwards. So note that here I'm dealing with a certain number of notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and I can have the same count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and likewise here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, now if you look more closely at the music, you will see that nonetheless, after Bach has given us his first fugue subject, there's something that's taking place that is also going to be imitated in that second part. And again, it's a little bit of an imprecise imitation, because where this thing goes up by second, again, this hops up by third. But even if that's the case, all we're going to be interested in whenever we're doing our analysis of fugue subjects is just looking at the fugue subject itself. So always count the notes that are used by your fugue subject carefully, and make sure that when you do analysis of imitation of fugue subjects that you're only considering the complete fugue subject, all of its notes, and not extending beyond that, just to keep things simple. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at is turning things upside down. These are all examples of normal imitation, both tonal and real. What we want to consider now is inversion. Okay, so we're returning to the idea of imitation, but rather than keeping it in its normal form, we want to explore some of the other options. In particular, what we're interested in to start out with is this technique of inversion. Remember, we've used that term before. It was associated with the inversion of intervals. We call that harmonic inversion. Remember, we had things like if you take a perfect fifth and then you take the lower pitch and move it on top, you got a perfect fourth. So there was a change in the actual interval size that was taking place. Or if we had a minor third and we inverted that, we got a major sixth. So that is harmonic inversion, and we'll understand why the term harmonic is applied there when we get to the next episode. But there is this other thing that we can refer to as melodic inversion, where you are actually taking the original intervals and preserving them, but in the opposite direction. So if I look here at my original Bach fugue subject, you can see that I have an inversion of it in precisely the same way that the original melody moves. The inverted version will take that and go in the opposite direction. So if my original started here, went down by step, and then up by a whole series of steps. My inverted version will start at some place and instead go up and then step down. And so what I've done is I've written these things above each other so that you can see the relationship between them. It's kind of like there's a musical mirror that's been placed in between. And in a sense, I could play them at the same time. It won't sound that great, but you can hear that kind of mirroring effect. Okay? So it doesn't sound that great combined in that fashion, but let's listen to what Bach does when he gives us an inverted imitation and then builds up a whole series of these things, one on top of the other. So I've notated the music leaving out some other parts in order for us to be able to hear these entries as clearly as possible. There, and of course, there. There's no rule that says that you have to have imitations in inversion only. You can combine normal and inverted forms, and Bach does that as well in this piece. So again, when we have multiple entries like this overlapping with each other, we have a general term for this, which is stretto. But what we're interested in are the particular techniques of imitation that Bach is using. These are all excerpts from a grand fugue. I'm just kind of hopping in at particular points to highlight these areas where Bach is employing these techniques so that we have a good example of them. I highly recommend that you listen to this fugue if you ever get the chance. It's from the Organ Prelude and Fugue in C major, BWV 547. It's one of my favorite fugues of all time. It's absolutely magnificent. And one of the things that you'll notice is that imitation is used almost as a kind of oral flashlight to draw listeners' attention to different parts of the texture. And it's also reinforcing this idea that all parts of the texture are of equal potential interest, and that's what makes it what we know as a polyphonic texture. Now, the other thing that we need to consider is not just this orientation of motion through melodic contours, but motion through duration. So if I have an original version of the Bach fugue subject with regular notation, I can clearly see what an augmented version would look like, and I can see what a diminished version would look like. The augmented version doubles the note values precisely, as you can see throughout, and the diminished version diminishes them precisely by half throughout. So if we hear this in context, Bach doesn't actually use a version in diminution, but he does use one in augmentation. And that is what we're going to get here. Another stretto where we have a normal but tonal form of imitation. There's that skipping down by a third. An inverted version, and by the way, the inverted version, of course, itself is tonal as well. So it hops up by third rather than going up by step. So you can have tonal inversions too. And then in the bass part, we're going to hear an augmented version of the fugue subject, which you can judge by the doubling of the note values. And this is an augmented version of the real imitation because it goes down by step, and then all the other intervals are precisely the same. So let's hear what this sounds like. Okay, so we can hear three different types of imitation being applied at the same time. This is normal procedure for Bach. He's exceptionally skilled at creating these very rich contrapuntal textures that freely exchange different types of imitation. So these kinds of works are ones that are extremely lively from the standpoint of imitation. But I do want to stress something. They are lively and creative rather than rigidly formal. The term fugue itself means flight in some sense. For example, some of you might have taken psychology courses and heard about patients going into fugue states. That's where often you have somebody who is usually accompanied by a form of amnesia. They seem to lose a sense of who they are and go wandering, and they can wander for several hundred kilometers and essentially come to somewhere else and wonder how they got there. So fugue state, flight, it's a sense of kind of escaping the regular constraints of everyday life. Now, a fugue is a rather striking piece because the beginning of a fugue is what we refer to as the exposition, and there are particular rules of engagement for creating a fugue exposition. It tends to have very strong formal regulation at the beginning, but after this fugue exposition, you have the rest of the fugue for which there are actually no compositional rules. So that's the kind of thing that made them very attractive to composers like Bach, because then he was free to come up with all of these different ways of using imitation, however he saw fit, whatever suited the particular characteristic features of the fugue subject he was working with, and he could do many other things besides. So ultimately, fugues were attractive, were written by many composers precisely because they offered this form of compositional freedom. Nonetheless, the last thing I would like to play for us is an example of Bach creating a canon of his own. Since we started with a canon, why don't we finish with one? I will go to another example from the course website, and in some senses this is going to be a basic canon, but it's going to be interested in this particular idea. We do not have in this particular fugue an example of the fugue subject being given in retrograde. If we look at this melody, if I were to start there and play it backwards, well, you can see that this is just a backwards version of my original fugue theme. What would it sound like then in this backward or retrograde form? And imagine that being buried in the midst of the musical texture that we've been encountering in all of the other examples. It would be very hard to hear that. So it could be the case that Bach decided not to use a retrograde form because he thought he had enough other interesting material to work with, and this is something that might not be readily heard. However, he was very fond, in fact, of retrograde imitation, and he wrote an entire piece, an entire canon that's based on retrograde motion. So that's what I'm going to show you next. Okay, so for the final segment of this episode, what we're going to listen to is a canon that Bach wrote, which again, by definition, because it's a canon, it's in two parts, but it's just one melody, but Bach wrote it in such a way that in fact it is playable against itself in retrograde form. So this is a retrograde canon from one of the canonic puzzles that was associated with a work called The Musical Offering. So just to give you a little bit of a clue as to what you can watch for and listen for, note that we have the start of this thematic idea. Just take it that far. If you go to the very end of this, that is the upper part. If I look at the lower part, I can see that it is moving precisely in retrograde form, right? So if I started here, So what you'll notice is that whatever this line does is done by this line in reverse, at least as it's notated. So what I am hearing together is the very tail end of what this one does at the same time, being played in reverse. So let's listen to this. It's a retrograde canon in C minor. So it's a wonderful little composition. I doubt whether any of us just listening to it for the first time would recognize how it was made. You probably noticed that even trying to follow along with the written music as it's playing and knowing that it's a canon, that it would be difficult to keep track of that. So here is a wonderful example of the canonic principle. In this case, it's a retrograde canon. The imitation is solely of the normal original form, right? The retrograde part is beginning at the same pitch, it's preserving the same melodic contour, it's preserving the same pacing, it's the same durations throughout. It is possible, of course, to have retrograde canons that do not do that, that will change, that will be a retrograde canon in diminution, for example, in which case one part will have to be played twice against itself in its imitation for it to work out. So there are many possibilities, but these are extremely difficult to write. And for that reason, what we are interested in this course is focusing on learning how to recognize smaller units of imitation, working with fugue subjects, and that's, I think, sufficient to get us interested in this fascinating musical topic.